Lord Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, we at SEB were delighted when we were approached by Mansion House and City of London to co-sponsor and collaborate with them on this annual event to honor the legacy of our very own Sir Roger Gifford. For those of you who are not so familiar with Sir Roger, a brief professional background, if I may. Clearly all of you know what he did as Lord Mayor in 2012. But before this, Sir Roger worked in investment banking within SEB. That was in the 1980s. He moved to Asia and to Japan in the mid-90s to head our Asian business, returned to London in late 2000, and in 2017 he decided to dedicate all his time towards supporting the bank in developing our sustainable agenda. At that time, Sir Roger had already been approached by the UK government to share its Green Finance initiative, which was launched to focus on growing the contribution of the financial sector to the G20 climate agenda. This led to Sir Roger chairing the government's Green Finance Task Force and finally the Green Finance Institute, established in 2019 with Dr. Rhian-Marie Thomas, who is here with us tonight as its CEO. Over the past few years, before his passing in 2021, Sir Roger worked with a strong passion to develop and promote sustainable finance. For SEB, he was essential in our pioneering efforts into green financing products dating back to 2008 when we advised the World Bank on their first green bond. I'm sure that everyone who knew Roger would agree that his contribution to addressing climate change and advancing green finance was immense. The establishment of this lecture, which will always have sustainable and green finance at its core, is a true fitting legacy to Sir Roger Gifford. And now to our speaker tonight, who really requires no introduction, but allow me to do so anyway. Mark Carney is currently the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, was the UK government's finance advisor for COP26 last year. Mark was previously the governor of the Bank of England, and prior to that, governor of the Bank of Canada. Mark's financial and international background, alongside his keen interest in a green recovery, is a perfect combination for setting us on the right path for meeting not only UK's commitment, but also international climate commitments. Mark, we are so grateful for you making the time to be with us here tonight. Roger would have been honored to have you as the first guest speaker at his inaugural lecture. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anders, my Lord Mayor, colleagues, friends. It is a great, great honor to join you this evening to commemorate Sir Roger Gifford. As you've heard, but I'm going to reinforce this point, he was an absolute luminary, not just in finance, but in climate finance. And he was because he combined the best in thought leadership with the most determined action, and we need both. When he first took up the cause in earnest, climate finance was on the periphery, or climate itself was on the periphery of finance. Few financial budgets considered the carbon budget. Net zero was a niche. But in no small part due to his inspiration and dedication that, in Sir Roger's words, the action taking place in finance today are almost unrecognizable from a few short years ago, as you said, Lord Mayor. Many accomplishments, I can't list them all, but I will re-emphasize his establishment and chairing of the Green Finance Initiative to leverage UK financial leadership and forge innovative climate solutions. Under his guidance, a few years later, the publication of the UK's Green Finance Strategy, which serves as the roadmap for some of the most important climate finance developments in this country and, by extension, the world, from the promotion of mandatory climate disclosure to the establishment of the Clean Growth Fund, and very importantly, and not because Rhian-Marie will be asking me questions in a moment, most importantly, the establishment of the Green Finance Institute. His foresight also lay the foundations for the UK's leadership during its COP presidency. Under Alok Sharma's guidance and tenacity, and he has both, And he's pretty suave as well, Alec, it has to be said. The proportion of global emissions covered by net zero country commitments rose from less than a third when the UK was assuming the presidency to 90%. Under the Glasgow Climate Pact, countries agreed to close the gap between their climate ambition and their actions, and for the first time, nations agreed to stop deforestation and phase down unabated coal power and inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. COP26 was also the first time that the private financial sector's role in the net zero transition was fully recognized, with 450 financial institutions from 45 countries making net zero commitments through sector-specific alliances as part of GFANZ, which looks to spearhead progress across the global financial sector. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment and let that figure sink in. Financial institutions controlling, responsible for balance sheets representing 40% of global private financial assets committed to supporting the net zero transition. And there are many more around the world, particularly in the emerging and developing world, who are working hard to address similar issues, even though their economies face some of the biggest climate challenges. And the best way to honor that incredible legacy of Sir Roger is by continuing to drive change and following his approach, and I'll quote his approach of taking a simple idea and building it into something much more extensive. And so what I'd like to do is focus my remarks this evening on how we make change happen. And I'll start with public policy, because change depends on governments, business, and finance all charting ambitious emissions reductions paths. In other words, they all need to undertake transition planning. They need to assess regularly the progress against those plans in order to identify gaps. They need to act to close those gaps. The financial sector can fund the necessary investments and through its own planning reveal in real time what those gaps are, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And they can reveal where public policy needs to do more. But let me spend a moment on governments and authorities. This process begins for them with a clear commitment to achieve net zero emissions on pathways consistent with limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. And in pursuit of that overarching goals, governments should set interim targets, including to achieve a fair share of the 50% decarbonization that's required to stay on track by 2030. They need to incentivize and they need to track progress. Of course, they need effective policies in order to move forward, but they also need to rely on independent oversight bodies to assess the adequacy of their measures. And all the while, the public and civil society will monitor progress, hold governments to account, and encourage better ways forward. And I'd say, and I've looked at a number of different jurisdictions over the years, let me commend the UK's exceptionally strong example. In 2019, it was the first major economy to enshrine decarbonization, a decarbonization goal in law. And last year, it raised its ambition to reduce emissions by 78% by the year 2035, 78% from 1990 levels, on a path to net zero emissions by 2050. So if you will, that clear, high-level ambition, interim target ambitious as well, that is step one. Step two is to put in place effective climate policies to drive action. Now, the UK has already reduced its emissions by almost 50% through policies such as carbon pricing, such as being one of the pioneers with emission trading schemes when it was part of the European Union and subsequently, off-take agreements that have helped scale clean energy technologies such as wind, moratoria just put in place on internal combustion engines that are spurring the development of EV production facilities and charging infrastructure, and a series of other measures from grants, tax breaks, funds for innovation, energy efficiency measures that are supporting the development of climate solutions from hydrogen to direct air carbon capture. And in parallel with this, the UK is one of the leaders in building the financial architecture that's necessary for net zero, including by putting explicitly in remit letters for financial regulators, including the Bank of England, the requirement to have regard to climate and the net zero transition in their activities. It includes the decision last year of the then Chancellor, now, well, soon-to-be Prime Minister, committing to make, I think that's settled, that one's settled, committing to make TCFD line climate disclosure architecture mandatory across the economy, and also crucially establishing the transition plan task force. That's step 2, policies. Step 3 is the independent oversight, and of course the establishment of the Climate Change Committee in 2008 creates a body that regularly evaluates the effectiveness of those public policies, provides that independent oversight and rigor that is absolutely crucial to meeting net zero. This year, the Climate Change Committee made over 300 recommendations to close policy gaps, because despite the fact that the UK has this 50% reduction since 1990, given the more ambitious goal, in the judgment of the committee, current plans, current policies exist for only about 40% of that incremental reduction. UK parliamentary committees also regularly assess progress and make new recommendations. And if I ever felt wistful about my old role, I just spent 2 hours in front of one of the parliamentary committees, and that disabused me of that. And in parallel, vigorous civil society, a competitive media, and an engaged public regularly hold authorities to account. So at the country level, there's this dynamic, familiar many of you, a clear objective, ambitious interim targets, effective policies to achieve them, robust real-time accountability. Now, I'll turn to how finance fits into this and how finance can help drive change. And the key word there is help. To be clear, finance will not drive the net zero transition on its own. It's an enabler, it's a catalyst that can speed what governments and companies initiate. But given the scale of the net zero commitments of the financial sector, that scale is so large now that if governments around the world truly want a sustainable, resilient, and fair economy, the necessary finance will be there. The first step for a financial institution is to mirror what governments are doing. In other words, and the example here brought through the alliances as part of GFANZ is by their own initiative, GFANZ members have committed to achieving net zero financed emissions by 2050 to support a global transition to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with low or no overshoot. To that end, GFANZ members are also setting interim science-based targets reflecting maximum effort towards their fair share of the 50% reduction in GHG emissions that's needed by 2030. The first targets are due, it depends on the alliance, but they're due within 12 to 18 months of joining the alliance, joining GFANZ. And that means that COP27 is the first way station to assess climate progress, and I'll come back to that. The second step for financial institutions is to develop comprehensive net zero transition plans. And in order to build a common foundation for those plans, GFANZ members have spent more than a year developing a pan-sector approach to this. It's involved hundreds of finance professionals from across the alliances, thousands submissions to the consultation, and a final version will be released for COP27. These are strategic plans which address every aspect of a financial institution's operations. Now, you have a plan, you need a strategy, and you need to implement against that, and that's the next step. We've identified 4 key strategies for transition finance, and the first 2 are obvious. Climate solutions, so technologies and products that enable the economy to decarbonize. The second is to finance business models that already are aligned with a science-based pathway to net zero, so think renewables. Now, there's some who would stop at these first 2, but crucially, the GFANZ framework makes clear that transition finance is about driving decarbonization in the real economy, not retreating to the false comfort of portfolio decarbonization. In other words, divesting your way to net zero in your portfolio. The world cannot do that. We must invest and grow. And that requires the third strategy, which is to go where the emissions are and to back credible plans of companies that are converging, helping those companies converge with science-based decarbonization pathways. And the last element is, in many respects, the most difficult, which is backing the managed phase-out of those high-emission assets that will be stranded in the transition. Now, in order to help financial institutions determine which companies to back and which to avoid, we've developed common expectations for the transition plans of companies in the real economy, and high-level guidance on how financial institutions can use sectoral pathways to assess company ambition. The fourth step in how finance can drive change is by growing transition assets across these four strategies, so all four of these strategies. And I'll come back to the progress in that respect in a moment. Final element, transparency. Just as governments need oversight bodies to assess the adequacy of their policies, the financial system needs an accountability mechanism to monitor how well the portfolios of financial institutions align with their targets. And that's why all of our work, from our global and net zero transition planning framework to regional tools and guidance, all of that will be underpinned by a new net zero data public utility. This will be operational next year, by this time next year, and it will provide consistent, accurate, openly available climate transition-related information to allow financial institutions, regulators, civil society, all stakeholders, the general public, to track climate progress. So accurate, trusted, verifiable climate transition data, including financed emissions, the emissions of the portfolio companies of financial institutions, targets of the financial institutions, performance against those targets, data that's openly available in a single place for free for the first time. And I want to commend all the major private data providers from London Stock Exchange, Refinitiv, S&P, Moody's, MSCI, Morningstar, Bloomberg, other people that I really care about who's not written here and I've forgotten. And then also the official sector, because this is backed, underpinned by the OECD, by the IMF, by the UN, IOSCO as well. So we have all that, and actually this information is a key component of how finance will drive change, because it's going to provide a powerful feedback mechanism for the financial institutions, for companies in the real economy, and for governments. Stakeholders will be able to track a financial institution's climate progress, including gaps between their targets and their performance, obviously. But they also will be able to compare financial institutions with their peers and assess the extent to which any gap that exists, and there's always gaps in climate, but any gaps that exist are idiosyncratic, in other words, due to the institution's performance itself, or generalized, the product of broader factors beyond the institution's control, such as inadequate country climate policies or poor enabling environments. Climate laggards can be called out and strong performers rewarded. In short, we have to both mind the gap but understand why it exists, and to the extent to which it's due to inadequate country climate policies. And we remind that the gap at present between the stated climate policies of countries, so these are the policies they intend to have, not the implementation of policies, but the gap between that and 1.5 degrees is a full degree of warming. Real-time feedback mechanism that will help distinguish both within sectors, within institutions, and feedback to governments. Okay, I've been promising a quick progress report and then I will close. So it's early days. GFANZ launched, the first wave at GFANZ was the spring of last year. That was 160 members at the time. For Glasgow, we were 450 members in the Alliance. You may have read some headlines about people leaving or thinking of leaving. So you'll be surprised to know that we're now 550 members. $130 trillion of assets under those balance sheets at Glasgow. Now, how many financial assets, this is a difficult point to make, have gone up over the course of the last year? Not as many as any of us would like. $150 trillion of balance sheet today. Those institutions, 550 institutions from over 50 countries, are now committed to supporting the transition consistent with limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. In parallel, we've also established regional networks in Asia Pacific and Africa to ensure that the transition to the net zero financial system takes into account different needs, different pathways, and brings benefits globally. Let me turn to individual, not specific institutions, but GFANZ members themselves and the progress that they're making. At present, 40% of the $42 trillion of assets managed by the first wave of net zero asset managers firms, we've got one sitting here, those are now committed to be managed in line with net zero. So confidence of those firms that 40% on average of their assets would be in line with net zero. All of the 160 founding members of GFANZ were required to set interim targets by COP27. We've already received over 250 science-based interim targets, and there's an additional 90 targets under review and on track to be confirmed by the start of Sharm el-Sheikh. All of these targets are consistent with their commitments and timelines of when the members join GFANZ in their respective alliances. One other point on progress. It's easy to forget, and I forget this sometimes too. At the start of last year, not a single bank, not one in the world, had a science-based 2030 target that included their financed emissions. In other words, the emissions of their clients, their loan book. Today, 53 banks have already done so, and we expect several more by COP27. So there was only 43 that were due by COP27. We're at 53. We'll be higher than that when we get there, from 0. This is substantial progress, and it's a clear sign that the hard work of implementing commitments is well underway. So, now, I'm just going to, before I close, and I will close in a second, but I do want to say a few words of what we're learning as part of this process, and I just want to flag 3 priorities that come out of the work. And the first is, and governments know this, but it bears repeating, that countries need to work harder to create the right policy environments. Last year, we had a policy call to action at COP, which outlined a series of recommendations. Next week, we'll release an update of that, which updates for our findings, given some progress against certain levers and offers specific recommendations on others. It makes clear that action by financial institutions, while critical and essential, is no substitute for governments, and certain responsibilities cannot be shifted to finance. So these are examples of these that G20 governments need to do. Sectoral specific pathways within their economies, key sectors for the transition. Align the international financial architecture with net zero delivery, and maybe we'll come back to that. I'll flag a point on that in a moment. Pricing the externalities around carbon, either explicitly or implicitly, and mobilizing capital flows to emerging and developing economies, particularly ensuring that the MDBs set their own net zero targets and crowd in private finance. The second big priority, in our view, is that the energy transition, I think everybody certainly in the country would think the energy transition needs greater focus. But particularly, there needs to be greater focus on the need to scale clean energy rapidly. At present, fossil fuels power over 60% of the world's electricity and supply 80% of the world's energy. So we can't simply decree the most complex energy transition in history by fiat. Transition means transition, And this requires not just a decline in fossil fuels, but a massive acceleration in clean energy investment. The IEA's calculations around this is a threefold increase this decade in order to stay on track or to get on track for 1.5 degrees. And that means that we need to scale clean energy investments such that for every dollar maintaining existing fossil fuel infrastructure, and this is an important point, we do need to spend dollars maintaining existing fossil fuel production and infrastructure for a period of time. We need at least $4 invested in clean energy. Today, the ratio is about 1 to 1. That's roughly on track. The point is it needs to scale very rapidly this decade. In fact, that's the biggest threat to not getting on track to 1.5 degrees. And then the final priority, which I've alluded to a few times and the COP president mentioned, is we need to focus much more on directing capital to emerging markets and developing economies, where by the end of the decade, as many of you know, an extra $1 trillion a year in clean energy investment will be required. So in partnership with governments, multilateral development banks, we're working to leverage country platforms and just energy transition partnerships to major emerging economies, including Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, and I want to salute the tireless work of Hendrik de Toit with respect to South Africa. But Hendrik, even this, he cannot do alone. What we need is donor governments to pool, to blend, and deploy their risk capital at much greater scale and much more flexibly. We need some new frameworks and facilities for transition finance, which support the managed phase-out of fossil fuels, which develop the market for carbon credits, and provide the incentives to retire high-emitting assets ahead of schedule. So to conclude, to draw on the capacity of private finance, we've made, and we see through GFANZ, the climate commitments on the scale that the world will require. We're developing the tools needed to operationalize those commitments, such as transition plans. We've created the governance to foster private sector leadership, and we're developing an open data utility to support accountability and accelerate change. And that's how finance can help address climate change. Not by just saying no, not by walking away, not by acting unilaterally, rather by working in concert with business, government, and civil society to catalyze, in Sir Roger's words, and I quote, the largest social and economic transformation the world has ever seen. Thank you very much.